I've recently come to believe that the differences between generations aren't rooted in the issue of a familiarity with technology or a lack thereof. Plenty of older adults have comfortably adapted to the advances in communications technology. Since human technology has obviously advanced along logical, mostly consistent pathways. Anyone familiar with one iteration of a device, concept, or system would, with practice, be able to familiarize themselves with its successors. The smartphone, though radically different from a standard landline of the late 90s, is in essence still a phone. And all the bells and whistles can be ignored or minimized so that the fundamental purpose, communication, can be utilized. The average person, regardless of generation, probably couldn't explain the technical aspects of the device that they use. Anyway, regardless of how well they would come to understand its superficial operation. People often joke about how if you were to travel back in time with a smartphone or a handgun, or any other tool or device which we were contemporarily familiar with, you could rise to some sort of high status or intellectual prominence. But this is extremely unlikely. If you were to bring a smartphone back to the Middle Ages, you would be ordered to explain how the device functioned. If you weren't immediately deemed a sorcerer and executed or imprisoned, and of course the average person couldn't begin to explain that, or even simplify the technical processes behind the phone's operation. You have in your hand a device which can essentially transmit thought, after you've spoken or typed it, across vast expanses immediately, ferried along by visually invisible signals. If you could even vocally communicate with people of a former time, there is nothing you could say in layman's terms that wouldn't be interpreted as magic. This rather protracted explanation is important to the story that I have to tell, because I need you to understand the absurdity of the situation that I encountered, and, of course, the morbid gravity of the situation. Anyone, given proper instruction or time, can come to understand anything, however strange or preternatural it may seem. While hanging out with my friend, we were approached by a group of people who must have been watching us. I say this because my friend had been showing me a meme on his phone while we ate in the outside dining patio of a burrito shop, and the group that approached us had said, "So, you guys like memes?" Now, my friend and I aren't the kind of people who openly talk about memes, as if there's some kind of special knowledge discussed with an esoteric club. Asking someone, at least these days, if they like memes, is pretty much the conversational equivalent of asking, "Hey, do you like jokes?" Everyone likes jokes of some sort. Another equally odd way to ask would have been, "Do you have the capacity to find things humorous?" It was an absurd question, if you thought about it for more than a few seconds, and we answered accordingly. I responded that, yes, we like memes, with no attempt to mask the decision in my tone. But the group, comprised of 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed as if they had just left Sunday morning service, didn't take offense to it, and immediately offered a follow-up question. What would you say is the most obsolete form of communication? Again, it was an odd question, and I didn't immediately know how to respond. My friend with a mouthful of burrito mumbled out, "I don't know," and I nodded along, unable to come up with an answer myself. The group exchanged quick glances, though I couldn't discern the meaning behind them. The woman, who had been standing behind the 2 men, approached and sat at the table, directly across from me. She looked into my eyes, and I saw something in her gaze that unsettled me. A sort of simmering mania, an instability of the mind kept in check only to appease social norms. After a few moments of staring, during which I uncomfortably held her gaze, she looked back to her companions and nodded in confirmation of something. They looked to each other, nodded, and turned back to my friend and I. Without warning, the woman then took my hand while looking deeply into my eyes and said, "Original human thought is incredibly inefficient. Ideating, conceptualizing, methodizing. It's also computationally slow. Sure, it may seem fast. You can carry out a conversation, even one of substance, without laboring over the formation of words. But it could be so much faster. So much more information could be shared through other means. For example, entire concepts, contexts, and layers of thought could be imparted by a single, properly constructed image." "You're talking about memes?" The woman smiled and her grip on my hand tightened. It was warm, and I felt the vitality of her life pulse through it. Ordinarily, I would have been freaked out and might have drawn my hand away. But despite the barely inhibited craziness in her eyes, I felt oddly comforted by the physical contact. Enchanted almost. She was fairly ordinary in appearance. I would even go as far as calling her unremarkable. Not ugly, but not someone you would look twice at. So I know that I wasn't enthralled by her looks, at least. Yes, exactly right. Memes, as you two have undoubtedly come to know in your experiences on the internet, can express a great deal of information, or references to information, with only an image. A meme may include a picture that's distorted, filtered, and edited in a way to appear similar to another picture, or incorporate elements of another picture. And from those simple modifications, you have something that would take several sentences to explain to someone. Unfortunately, memes so far in the public sphere have been used only for mundane, terrestrial humor. While there's nothing inherently wrong with that, memes could be utilized for much greater, wider-spanning purposes. Still holding my hand with one of hers, she motioned with the other, and one of the men removed a picture from his pocket and placed it on the table. Automatically, I moved my food aside, forgetting my hunger, as if the warmth which had spread from the woman's body to mine had also sated me. My friend, who had finished his food, turned the picture around, and after studying it for a few seconds said, "I don't get it." The woman nodded almost solemnly and then slid the picture over to me. She stared at me with anticipation, as if hoping or confidently suspecting that I would have better luck than my friend. I brought the picture in front of me and immediately understood my friend's inability to comprehend the image. It was bizarre, definitely multi-layered in terms of meanings and ideas. I couldn't focus on a single object. Everything was distorted, warped, or proportionally exaggerated to become virtually indistinguishable from the background. It was as if a series of random objects had been fed to an AI, and the AI had been instructed to artificially produce a work of art, an incredibly abstract piece of art. As if sensing my struggle with reconciling the image into something understandable, the woman's grip tightened, and I felt another surge of warmth. This time, it was almost electrifying. My mind, as if it had been previously beset by a fog, suddenly cleared, my thoughts no longer beleaguered by some undetected impediment. On the piece of paper, the image suddenly began shifting, or rather, my perception of its chaos changed. My mind started to make sense of what had just moments ago seemed random and disordered. Without prior knowledge, I came to understand aspects of the image, and once I had fully understood these, the overall message, the thing to get, finally came to me, and I couldn't help but chuckle. It was a joke of sorts, a bit of black humor, but certainly not something you would see made by any human. I can't begin to put a description of the image into words. You'd have to see it for yourself, and labor over the reconciliation of the visual chaos just as I had. All I can say is that the image, the joke, was made at mankind's expense, thought of by entities well beyond us, This meme, despite how absurd it may sound, was an example of not just interspecies contact, but cross-cosmic contact. It wasn't until I had been given the ability to fathom the bizarre arrangement that I realized the extragalactic, ultra-terrestrial nature of the picture. I was floored. My mind was suddenly filled with the profound existential implications. The woman released my hand, folded the picture and handed it back to her male companion, and then stood up. It was a clear day. There were people around, and we had been sitting in a public space. And yet in that moment, I felt totally alone, even separate from these strangers who had introduced the picture and its awful meaning into my life. The group of strangers asked if I would like to come with them, and for some reason, I agreed. My friend protested, but I ignored his words and followed the group mindlessly, trailing behind them while the world around me appeared to grow dim and insubstantial. I followed them to a van and climbed in once space had been made to accommodate me. The last thing I saw of that area was my friend standing on the curb, mouth agape, with his phone in his hand. I dully sensed the vibration of my phone in my pocket, but ignored the call. Beside me, one man stared ahead, and the woman drove casually along. The other man sat in the front beside her and had withdrawn the image from his pocket. He studied it, as if mesmerized. His head tottered without restraint. His shoulders rose and fell in accordance with deep breaths. We drove for maybe 20 minutes, before turning into a residential neighborhood. Eventually, we arrived at a house. It was normal, not a ramshackle hut, nor an ominous-looking compound, as you might expect the meeting place of a cult to be. The exterior of the house was perfectly unimposing, an ordinary suburban home. We filed in through the front door, leaving the van parked in the driveway. There was no one else outside, although many cars sat in driveways or along the street. But once inside, the circumstances you would expect to find in a cult-related environment were abundantly present. Documents, images, and other papers spanned every surface, some stapled or taped together to form great and ugly tapestries upon the walls. I saw images that looked similar to the one that I had been shown, either in respect to the superficially disordered arrangement or the veritable aura of cosmic suggestion imbued within. Strange, morphologically unrecognizable idols sat atop shelves. Even larger ones were seated like sinister-looking dolls in chairs. These idols, which were presumably physical representations of figures within the images, were all at the very least eerie. Some were actually quite shocking, affronts to my very human sensibilities. The group let me take in the weird and disturbing sights, possibly thinking that I'd be mesmerized by them, before leading me into another room. Before we entered, the man who had been studying the picture taped it to a wall that contained many similar images, parting from the picture with extreme reluctance. This next room was a sort of den, and a dim red light seemed to radiate from the very walls, giving everything a disturbing crimson tinge. I saw no other sources of illumination. There were other people in this room, and all were reverently prostrate before larger images that resembled paintings. 4 massive canvases on easels were lined against the rearmost wall, each bearing an image of a visually assaulting nature. While the smaller pictures of the previous room could be looked upon with only slight discomfort, as your brain tried to make sense of them, these pictures were almost obscene in their effects of confusion, distorted beyond tolerance, violently confounding. A vague yet potent dread began to form in my heart. The group that had brought me to the home went and assumed the position of the other attendees, and the woman beckoned me to join them. Even from the distance at which I stood, I felt a powerful presence within the paintings, or a force or element that resonated from them. I couldn't bring myself to move closer, but I nonetheless knelt where I had been standing. I didn't do this because I felt any spiritual urge to submit to those awful images, but because the look I had seen in the woman's eye before, that barely contained mania, had finally been set free. There was uninhibited insanity in those eyes. Her gaze, though probably unintentionally malicious, made my skin crawl, and the primal alarms in my brain began to go off. I just didn't want to provoke her in any way. Once I had knelt, with head bowed almost to the ground, the worship began. The people all uttered some ululating chant, which I couldn't have hoped to repeat and can't even begin to properly transcribe. They did this for nearly a minute, and then spoke in a language that might have been Latin, or possibly even older. I couldn't tell. Next, a command was shouted by the woman, and I heard the rustle of clothing. Peeking up, I saw that they had raised their heads, and so I did the same. But they had placed their hands over their faces, shielding them from viewing the paintings before them. Seeing as how I wasn't informed of any of these strange rites beforehand, I didn't think I would be chastised about my failure to follow along. Utterly freaked out, I watched them conduct another choral chant, and finally remove their hands from their faces. And to my horror, they all started maniacally laughing at the pictures before them. The laughter was deep, blackly sincere. This was no performance or aspect of some ritual. They earnestly found great humor in those abysmal images. I felt sick, physically and psychologically, as I witnessed the convulsive movements of their bodies, the abrasive cacophony of their combined cackling. But what drove me from the house, what has plagued me with the most awful and infernal nightmare since, wasn't the laughter itself. It was when the woman turned back to me, and I saw that her face had started to melt. And yet, despite the agony she must have been feeling in that moment, she had continued to laugh, splattering the ground with molten flesh. The others too had started to undergo a similar disintegration. The gray carpet beneath them was soon coated in the gruesome drippings. An eyeball, partially liquefied, rested atop a pool of skin-colored slime, blindly peering at me. With my eyes closed and hands thrown out to feel my way around, I fled from that awful house and those cosmically caustic images.